All right. Well, welcome everyone to our first ever Kelsey Museum virtual Flash Talk. For those of you who are new to this format, a Flash Talk is a brief presentation about a current research project followed by a lengthy Q&A. Our presentation today should last about 15 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of discussion with you, our audience. Please keep yourselves muted during the presentation, but feel free to unmute yourself for the discussion part. And as you've heard, we are recording this and we'll hopefully get it up on our website soon following this event. Our speaker today is Geoff Emberling. Geoff is a research scientist at the Kelsey Museum and a lecturer in the Department of Middle East Studies. He is the co-director of the International Kourou Archaeological Project in Sudan. And today he'll be speaking to us about his current research project, a new book he's working on related to his research on ancient Kush. So welcome, Geoff.
All right, I'm gonna just start by sharing my screen. See if I can do that effectively here. That's the end of the presentation, that's nice. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, it's really nice to see so many friends here. Thanks, Kathy. It's interesting that the Kelsey is launching this series of Flash Talks that gives us a chance to talk about work that's going on at the museum in a shorter, more casual format and with more opportunity for feedback. It's a nice idea, and I have to say that I feel about 15 years younger just participating in something called a Flash Talk. Makes me feel kind of hip, so I'm happy about that. I'm working on a number of different projects at the moment, but today I just want to talk about a new book about ancient Kush that I'm just starting to write with my colleague Sami Elamin, who's pictured here. I think we usually don't start talking about book projects right when we start them for the reason that we don't always finish them in the time that we had hoped to. But I'm pretty excited about this, so I thought I would give it a try. Kush is the dominant power, was the dominant power in what we call the Middle Nile region in antiquity that stretched from the northern border of Sudan and Egypt down to where the blue and white Niles join at Khartoum. This area is often called Nubia, but that's a late Greek term, and we prefer to use the name that the people used for themselves, and that is Kush. Why are we writing this book? There are lots of reasons. I've listed some of them there. There's been a lot of new archaeological research since the last kind of overview book on Kush was written. I mean, you can, everyone has their own favorite, but for me, that's the overview of David Edwards, written in 2004. Some of the work includes a major dam salvage project that newly investigated 150 kilometers of the Nile Valley at the Fourth Cataract. And another is major funding from the government of Qatar that funded about 40 or a little more archaeological projects in Sudan for 5 or 6 years, ending in 2019. So new research is one of the reasons. Another is recentering the history of Kush. So there's a long history of scholarship about Kush that's been either overtly racist or more recently continues to look at Kush from the perspective of Egypt. And there are by now generations of scholars who've been working to reorient the ways that we talk about Kush, that is to tell its history from its own perspective. But there are continuing opportunities to develop that approach. As far as I know, this is going to be the first sort of general overview book co-authored by a Sudanese scholar with a foreigner, and a foreigner being me. And we hope this will put different traditions of interpretation and perspectives on heritage and of the importance of Kush into an interesting dialogue. My co-author, Sami, is a senior archaeologist with Sudan's Antiquities Service, and we've worked together on our excavation project in Sudan over the last 5 years. We hope that the book will show that Kush was a significant ancient culture in Africa that interacted with all the major powers in North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the biblical world. That's not the only reason it's important, of course. We have reasons to think that the connections of Kush extended widely in other directions into Africa, but research hasn't caught up with that interest. And so there's at the moment little that we can say about that concretely. Point three, we're going to be taking an anthropological perspective. So rather than a narrowly archaeological book. So to the extent we can, we're going to focus on people and culture of Kush rather than solely on the monuments and artifacts. One part of that is trying to move away from telling the story solely through the perspective of the elite. It's somewhat difficult to do given the state of archaeology in Sudan at the moment, but we will do that to the extent that we can. Part of the way that we're going to advance the narrative is through mini biographies, and choosing the people that we tell stories about is going to be one way that we try to tell stories outside the elite. And then finally, I see I can't quite spell interest, but I gave it a try. Another reason is that there's a lot of interest in African history right now, partly because of Black Lives Matter and partly because of broad interest in trying to develop anti-colonial archaeologies and histories. And Africa is a rich area for rethinking those kinds of issues. So the book is going to be basically chronological, and I thought I could illustrate some of the ways in which we're presenting new ideas rather than just sort of going through the entire history. This slide made me laugh because it looks really dull. But in fact, this is the result of years of archaeological research in the eastern desert of Egypt and Sudan, identifying sites in areas where that is in the middle of the Sahara now. In early prehistory, however, there was a significantly wetter phase. There was a lot of settlement in the Sahara. And if you look at the middle two strips there, you see that there are virtually no sites in the Nile Valley itself. So these are sites of herders, mobile populations out in the deserts of Sudan and Egypt. And what happens at the end of the sequence is that they suddenly settle in the Nile Valley around 5000 BCE. And they settle in the Nile Valley in Egypt and Sudan. And this is one of a series of reasons that it has recently been argued that in fact the origin of Egyptian civilization, or a significant part of the origin of the population that made up ancient Egypt, in fact came from these herders and pastoralists in Africa. So this is not going to be a book about Egypt, but I'm going to argue that, we're going to argue that Egypt and Sudan shared that common cultural heritage and biological population background. So that's some of the early prehistory of Kush. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of first development of complexity. This is not Kush per se, but it still informs the development of Kushite culture. And this is around 3000 BCE. We have a group of cultures called the A group that developed into complex cultures at the same time as the pre-dynastic states, city-states of Egypt. This has been a contentious issue in some ways, and interpretations in the past have maybe overstated the extent to which the A group was leading this development. But anyway, it's an important part of the story of rebalancing the historical story. During the time of the A group, in Kush itself, if you look down below on the map, you can see at the site of Kerma. This would become the capital of Kush when it is first mentioned in historical texts. And we know something about Kush in this early period. It was a cattle herding village, and you can see a reconstruction of it down below. Kush is first mentioned, of course, not in its own text, but in Egyptian texts around 2000 BCE. And at that time, its capital was at Kerma, the city of Kerma. Here you see the model of the city. I'm going to argue that although this was a relatively small settlement, around 25 hectares, that it was fully urban in terms of the degree of specialization of activities that were performed in the city, and it is built around, as you can perhaps see, a monumental core, large building known as the Fufa there at the center. Okay. Early Kush was conquered by the Egyptian Empire, which ruled over Kush as a colonial domination for a little over 4 centuries, 1500 to a little after 1100 BCE. It used to be thought, and this is now going back quite a while, that essentially Kush disappeared under the New Kingdom domination. And that is definitely not the case. And we can see in a number of different ways, partly through studies by my colleagues, Michelle Bouzon and Stuart Tyson Smith, been doing some interesting work on looking at the way that the colonial environment produced new kinds of cultures rather than simply a replacement of one by the other. I'm not going to talk in detail about this image, but I will just simply say that this is a picture of Kushite tribute being brought to the Egyptian governor or viceroy of Kush. And I want to just zoom in on the top row of that image quickly. And you can see in this image that, in fact, there's a wide range of Kushite expressions of culture as depicted, of course, in an Egyptian tomb. But you can see ranging from very Egyptian kind of styles to the right, and to the left, you can see people being led as enslaved people, their arms bound. And so this image encapsulates some of that complexity of the colonial situation in Kush. The theology of Egyptian empire in Kush was complex. On the one hand, the Kushites were traditional enemies of Egypt, and that continued during the New Kingdom. But at the same time, there developed a theology in which there were many local forms of the Egyptian god Amun. And here we have a representation, a slightly later representation of the ram-headed form of Amun, Amun of Napata. This is another example of recent work that's been done. In this case, it's conservation work that's brought this painting to quite vivid life. So we will then talk about the, well, there's an intermediate stage that I will just mention. So traditionally, there's been considered to be a dark age between the end of the New Kingdom and the rise of Napata. More and more research is filling this in a variety of interesting ways, partly continuation of local authority, partly construction of fortresses, both in the Nile Valley and outside the Nile Valley during this period. And so there's quite a bit of new research that is challenging this idea of a dark age. In fact, since we're going to be arguing that the Kushites continued through this period, this is an important part of that argument. Okay. The height of the empire of Kush was when they conquered Egypt and ruled there as the 25th dynasty. And here you see an example of a statue that is sometimes referred to as Egyptianizing. And the use of that term, again, brings out the kind of the nuances of cultural relationships between Kush and Egypt. Of course, there's no denying the fact that this is the period when Kush adopted Egyptian writing, hieroglyphs, adopted styles of royal sculpture, as you see here, in a wide variety of Egyptian cultural forms. But the difference between saying that Kush selectively adopted aspects of Egyptian culture and saying that Kush was Egyptianized is precisely the important difference. We're trying to give Kush agency in this process and to retain the focus on Kush and not make it a passive recipient of Egyptianization. This period is interesting in some ways. In a lot of ways, we've known most of the basic royal inscriptions and monuments since the 1930s. But there are a number of new developments in interpretation, and among them are the increasingly important role of the royal women of Kush. Here is a tomb painting from El Kuru of Queen Kalhata, unfortunately defaced in a very deliberate sort of way. But she was a queen mother, wife of a king, and so we'll be bringing out the important role of Kushite women. One of the major exceptions to what I just said about that we knew most of this period by the 1930s is relatively recent work at the site of Sanam. So this is a big urban center that had been excavated earlier. And here you see a building. This is a 267-meter long building known as the Treasury, with a big colonnaded hall in the center of it, large storerooms on either side, stone paved, quite a massive construction. One of the rooms was mostly empty, it was burned. One of the rooms contained ivory tusks. And so that combined with finds of royal seal impressions have suggested that this was a kind of entrepot for royal trade activity. More recent excavation by my colleague Irena Vincentelli has also excavated a craft production workshop, also with many royal seal impressions, that further supports the idea that the palace was deeply involved in controlling production and trade of precious goods. In the finds of that workshop were also huge quantities of amphory traded from the Mediterranean, from Egypt and the Mediterranean. So trade was an important part of the economy of Kush. The Kushites were pushed out of Egypt by the Assyrian army in 664 BCE, and the next 4 centuries in Kush are known mainly by royal burials and royal texts from the region of Napata. Our excavation at El Kuru shed a little bit of light on political tensions in that period, and we'll be able to present that data in the book. Moving toward the end here. By 270 BCE, the location of royal burials had moved far south to the site of Meroe. Here you see the royal cemetery of Meroe. Culturally, this phase of Kush was significantly different than the earlier Napatan period, retaining some Egyptian practices and ideas about kingship, divinity, burial ritual, and so on, but also introducing a number of new non-Egyptian ideas. New script, a new important god, the lion-headed god Epidemic, and a new ritual importance for sorghum, and particularly the beer that was made from it. Kushite queens take on even more prominent roles during this period. You can see a representation of one on the right side of this pylon. They ruled on their own in some cases. They could lead the army into battle. And were represented as particularly powerful figures. City of Meroe has long been known as an ironworking center based on massive heaps of iron slag that cover the site. But one of the most important recent projects from our perspective has analyzed the timing of the development of ironworking at the site and has shown that it began already during the Napatan period. So Kush collapsed after 300 CE for a variety of reasons, including the rise of Aksum in Ethiopia that may have interfered with Kushite trade, the rise of a group called the Noba, who were military adversaries of the Kushites, may also have played a role. So finally, we'll discuss the legacies of Kush, both in later kingdoms in the Middle Nile region and in heritage today. Modern Nubians claim to be heirs of ancient Kush, but Kush is also taken as a symbol of Sudan as a nation as a whole. During the 2019 popular revolution in Sudan, prominent female protesters were called Kandake, which is the Kushite word for queen, and street art featured ancient figures and symbols as part of an image of a new Sudan. So with that, I will stop talking and we can have some questions.
Thanks so much, Geoff. We'll open the floor to questions now. If you don't feel comfortable speaking out with your question, feel free to type it in the chat and we can answer it that way too. And
when is my, here, I'm just gonna, we got a chat question. When is the book being published? Well, we have to finish writing it first. So I would say in 2022. That's my claim. We'll see how that works out. I don't know if I mentioned it's being published by Oxford University Press. That's the point.
well, I'll ask a question while we're waiting to see if anybody else has one. So could you speak a little bit more about the storage building you found that was discovered, not you, but that has been studied with materials from the Mediterranean? And what kinds of things were being traded?
Yeah, I mean, the trade goods that come into Kush are well, in the earlier period, it's a lot of amphory. So they're trading olive oil, wine from Egypt, from the Eastern Mediterranean. And in later times, in classical times, there was, in addition to ongoing trade in amphory and the contents of them, there was quite a bit of Hellenizing objects that were made in Kush, but also gifts that were sent from the Greek and Roman world. Kush was in contact with those cultures, and in fact, some of the there's a fair amount of writing in the classical tradition about Kush, so that forms also interesting.
Great, thank you. So we do have a bunch of questions now in the chat. So let's see. Okay. Not using Egyptianizing is interesting since among others have used it freely. Do you have an alternative?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a question of how you think about it. Are they being Egyptianized? I mean, this is a kind of a debate that has played out in use of the term Romanization. I think you can say that as long as you leave the agency with the Kushites themselves, they are choosing to make things in Egyptian styles, then I personally think that that's fine. But if you're saying that they're doing it unconsciously or they're being Egyptianized, it's like they're being converted, I think in earlier generations, it was sort of assumed that Egyptian culture was superior. And so naturally there would be attempts to crudely imitate, the superior culture. That's the kind of perspective that we want to get away from. And this is coming from Janice, who's definitely not using that perspective in her own work. So Anyway, I mean, I think that this is, I think that scholars who are actively working in Kush mostly recognize this. This is the direction that scholarship on Kush has been moving in. You know, really over the last 40 years, I think you can see steps in that direction. But it's surprisingly hard to get ourselves to think outside those older paradigms. So.
And we have another one along the same lines. Isn't Hellenizing problematic in the same way as Egyptianizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not the term itself. It's how you it's just making sure that you leave agency in the hands of the makers of things. So
Let's see. Plans for the Kelsey Museum to have an exhibition of this book.
Well, I think exhibitions at the Kelsey that might involve Kush are going to involve other things that we're doing, but I'll certainly hope to have Sami come here, and it'd be nice to have him give a talk about his work and his perspectives. In fact, some of us are working to develop an American research center in Sudan. As a part of that, we're sponsoring a series of talks at the ASOR conference in the fall, and we're inviting Sudanese colleagues, and Sami will be one of those colleagues who's going to tell us all from his perspective how scholars and the media continue to perpetuate racism in scholarship. So yeah, I think having Sami and his colleagues increasingly involved will be good.
And we have a question about, to get away from Egyptian-centered interpretation of ancient Nubia, we might consider offering doctorates in Nubiology in addition to degrees in Egyptology. Do you know of any American universities that are considering this option?
Well, I mean, that would be great. You know, so part of the structural, my cat has just climbed halfway up the screen door, and this, I think she wants to come in. It's snowy outside. Anyway, yeah, part of the structural racism, I think we have to, that attends study of Kush is the fact that institutionally there are no positions in Nubian studies anywhere in the United States. There are, I see lots of my colleagues here who teach aspects of this or do research on aspects of it, but none of us has a position that is a Nubian position. So I think, yes, it would be great if there could be degrees in Nubiology, I suppose. But I mean, like a first step would be just having a position or two in the country that was devoted to the study of this culture. I would also say that, we can't go all the way. We can't ignore Egypt in understanding Kush. We need to have people who you need to know about the hieroglyphic tradition and so on. So it's not a question of pretending that Egypt doesn't exist. That's not the solution. But yeah, I think all of us working in Sudan today would support the idea of having faculty positions in this field.
And then I think we have time for about maybe 2 more questions. So we have one that says, will your book be useful for a more general audience, or could you recommend some non-purely academic work on Kush or Merowe?
Yeah, Oxford wants us to write this for the general public. And so, figuring out exactly where that's gonna, what that's gonna mean, we won't have as many references maybe. But yeah, it's going to be written in an accessible style, and it's not going to assume a lot of foreknowledge.
Right. Now, the last question we have here is, you mentioned that you are convinced that trade connections extended widely into Africa, but research hasn't caught up with that yet. Can you please talk a bit about what you have learned to hint at that? I assume the ivory found at Sanam, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name.
Yeah.
But were there other precious goods possibly coming from Eastern Africa, the Swahili coast, etc.?
Yeah, well, so there are raw materials that passed into Kush and on into Egypt that we see, for example, in those tribute scenes that show that, you know, Nubia as a whole, you know, Kush and other cultures in the Middle Nile region were in contact with areas further to the south. The problem with identifying specific sources of those goods is that there's almost no excavations, you know, south of Khartoum. The Swahili coast is further away than I think we've been able to document any specific kinds of context. But basically the problem is just a total lack of archaeological excavation. You know, to give one example, there was relatively recently, I guess about 10, 12 years ago, an inscription out in the Western desert in Egypt that mentioned a place called Yam. And so some people have thought that that means that Yam would have been in that direction, and that direction would have been in Darfur. Not everybody agrees about this, but anyway, it raises the question of whether there could have been you know, kind of a significant ancient culture in Darfur. And for, you know, obvious reasons, it's been impossible to dig in Darfur over the last, I don't know, 40 years or something. But that's just one example. We just don't have any excavations, almost no excavations that give us that kind of, you know, what the pottery would look like, for example. Another thing we can hope for the future.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Geoff, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our first Fast Talk. Please join us next month on March 5th for Fast Talk, looking at our numismatic collections with our new curator, Irene Sotomarin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Great to see you guys.